Chapter 6 The Home of the Twig Prince. Late the next morning Abigail finally awoke. A cool breeze came through the open window chilling Abigail's nose, so she rolled her back towards it. She also pulled the blankets completely over her head for good measure, so as not to be disturbed again. When she had nearly drifted back to sleep she suddenly realized that she had no idea where she was. Instantly wide awake, heart racing, she opened her eyes like a bolt, but saw only the white of the bedsheets over her head. Even when she slowly pulled them she couldn't see much more than the ceiling because the mattress enveloped her on all sides. Getting out of the bed was no easy task. It was almost like trying to struggle out of a very deep snow bank where you've sunken in past your waist. Usually such things seem to be very easy to someone watching, but surprisingly difficult when you have to do it yourself. This bed, in fact, had never been used by anyone, and was made by someone who didn't have the slightest notion of why anyone would like a soft bed. Usually when people know you need something but do not understand why, they tend to overcompensate. That is what this bed was, an overcompensation, like sleeping on a giant down pillow. Finally, she made her way out, tumbling onto the floor. On the air was the smell of breakfast. It smelled simply amazing, because this food, much like coffee, smelled good all the time whether you were in the mood to eat it or not. Presently, because Abigail was very much in the mood to eat anything at all, the food smelt very good indeed. Abigail had fully intended to explore the house and find out where she was, but since she had not had a true meal since she came to Realm, hunger pangs gripped her instantly. As she wandered from her little bedroom she noticed that the cottage itself was very strange, for on one end it was very cozy, full of dark woods, worn stones, and brass knobs. The floors were covered by ornately woven rugs, and all the furniture had upholsteries made of felt or corduroy in earthy tones. The walls were completely lined with books in wraparound cases, which only stopped at the stone foundations. But as she walked into the kitchen it seemed as if the small wooden walls fell away, opening into a wide bright room made of slated stone. There were tall clerestory windows that reached to the ceiling which allowed the sunlight to flow in. Similarly there were other additions stretching in all directions so that the original cottage was almost lost in the maze of greenhouses, stargazing towers, libraries, and mechanical workshops. On the stove boiled many kettles and pots full of wonderful and mysterious things, some of which Abigail had never seen before, but all of them smelled delicious. The Twig Prince was sitting before her at a table in the middle of the room with two place settings. Abigail noticed that the table was slightly too tall for her, and when she sat down her feet dangled, and she had to put her elbows on the table to reach her plate. It made her think that it was quite cruel of parents to scold their children for placing their elbows on the table, for she could not eat if she did not. The plate was full of bright unique things, some otherworldly but others seemed familiar. Abigail did not discriminate between the two, for a ravenous appetite tends to make you a much more adventurous eater. On her third helping, as her eyes roamed across the table searching for what else she might try, she noticed that the prince was watching her intently. He didn't say anything, but every once in a while he nudged a pot of blue porridge in her direction, or a platter of roasted beast a little closer, hoping she might try it. But he refrained from asking her questions, for her mouth had been full since she sat down, and even a walking tree knows it's very rude to speak to people with your mouth full. I'm afraid Abigail was a bit too curious to worry about such pleasantries and soon addressed the prince. "Where are we? Are we still on Earth?" asked Abigail, which is a pretty fair question to ask if you meet a walking tree. "Earth, of course, it's just below the foundation, or there's a nice garden in the back with plenty of fertile black soil," said Benjamin, who was a bit confused, but hopeful that she might enjoy burying her toes in rich dark earth as much as he did. "No, I mean, what is the name of this world?" corrected Abigail. "Are we still on the earth?" "The world is called Realm, and there is much earth, and also much sea," said the prince. Abigail was beginning to get a little more frustrated. "I come from a place called Earth. Have you heard anything of it at all?" she asked again. "Oh, I see now, you come from some place called Earth. Is it underground?" asked the prince, trying to be helpful. No, the place is called Earth, but it's just like here, full of sky, and land, and sea," said Abigail. "Then why is it called Earth? Why would anyone name their whole world after dirt?" asked the prince. "I don't know, it just is, okay. I'm not really in charge of those things," said Abigail. "Well, you should probably bring it up to someone who is," said the prince. "Well, why is your world called Realm?" asked Abigail indignantly. "I'm not really sure either, but it's a lot better name than Earth," said the prince. "I really don't think so," muttered Abigail. But then she thought, maybe this is just an island off the coast which is so isolated that they don't know anything about the outside world. "If this is Realm, then what city or state are we in, and what's the capital?" asked Abigail, hoping to confirm that this was only a small place, and she hadn't traveled very far. "Well, down the path a bit is the village of Chatterdale, in the kingdom of South Innsbruck, in the land of Beren. The capital of South Innsbruck is Utopia, I believe," rattled off the prince matter-of-factly. All this sounded very complex and not island-like at all to Abigail, and none of this was helping her get home. "What about you then, do you come from here?" she asked. "No, certainly not," said the prince, "I come from the Oaken Kingdom across the sea in Greenland." At this Abigail perked up quite a bit, since she had certainly heard of Greenland before, and could even find it on a map. "Oh, Greenland, wonderful! I know where Greenland is. I was beginning to become terribly distressed that I had no way back home whatsoever. Now all I need to do is figure out where we are from there," said Abigail excitedly. "Brilliant!" exclaimed the prince, who was very pleased indeed that someone around here was familiar with his homeland. "Tell me, Abigail, what things have you heard of Greenland? Have you heard there are more walking trees than grains of sand on the beach, and of the cool refreshing streams, or of the gentle rock giants that guard the sacred forests? Perhaps the great sequoias that reach to the heavens?" "No, from what I heard, it's mostly full of ice and volcanoes," said Abigail disappointedly, and then added, "They hardly sound like they're the same place." "Hardly," said the prince, also disappointed. Abigail soon felt that this conversation was leading nowhere, and regardless of where she was, she had better resolve to make the best of it. So at that point she asked a question that I assume you have been wondering for quite some time. "How is it that you can understand me and no one else can? Or for that matter, how come I can understand everyone even though you're speaking a language I've never heard before?" asked Abigail very intently. "I don't think that I am the only one who can understand you. I suspect anyone who spoke Babelese would, once they get past the accent, of course. The reason you understand me is because I'm speaking a universal language. Why you're choosing not to I couldn't say, but it is quite inconsiderate," said the prince. "I don't understand," said Abigail. "Simply put, there are two universal languages, Babelese and Atlantian. Any word said in these languages can be understood by anyone who hears it. Your language is neither, but very obviously comes from Babelese, so I can piece it together. Your trapper friends, however, spoke Atlantian, which is quite different, so they had no real way to figure out what you were saying," explained the Twig Prince. Abigail thought for a moment about this, and nearly began a few sentences all starting with the word but before she did she was able to answer them for herself in her head. Then she finally thought of one that she could not figure out for herself. "But where did these languages come from?" asked Abigail. "They came from a place far away, and spread to Realm when people could cross the worlds freely. They came from the most glorious world of them all, the world of man. The only creature to bear the image of God. But alas, Because of our disobedience the way between the worlds was shut, and man lost their languages, leaving them only able to speak gibberish and not able to understand each other's words," said the prince. Again all of this sounded very familiar to Abigail, but she couldn't quite place it. Then all of a sudden it came over her like a flash. "Babel!" she exclaimed, "that was on earth, I learned about it in church." "By Jehovah!" exclaimed the prince, "that would make you an image-bearer. I have certainly seen quite a few things as I've traveled east, but never once did I believe I would see an image-bearer." "Wait," said Abigail puzzled, "you just said by Jehovah. How is it that you happened upon the same God I believe in if we are in realm, and, even on earth he is considered one God of many? But is he not the real God, the one who made all things?" asked the prince. "I mean yes, of course," said Abigail. "Well, it seems to me that if there is only one God it would be pretty silly for him to only bother to tell one of his worlds. Besides, he is one God over all, he is in heaven and does what he pleases," said Benjamin. This somehow sounded familiar to Abigail as well. Next Abigail asked something that I probably wouldn't have bothered with, but it was a very pressing mystery in her mind about the prince. "If you're a walking tree from a world full of walking trees, and have never heard of Earth, then why is your name Benjamin? Shouldn't it be something more tree-like?" asked Abigail, but before Benjamin could answer there was a crash as a bowl of fruit fell off of an end table on the other side of the room. Abigail quickly looked to see what had caused it, but couldn't see anything. The table sat like its own little island in the room next to the prince's easel, and apart from a stack of a few books and a strange artist's mannequin leaning against it, there was nothing even remotely nearby. The bowl of fruit was obviously being used for a still life, which was half finished on the easel. The prince leaned forward and confirmed Abigail's suspicions. "Don't look now, but you're being watched," he whispered, and glanced back to the end table. Abigail looked at the end table and out of the corner of her eye saw that the mannequin was now crouched behind it staring at her. Abigail jumped out of her seat with a start. "Come now, Fern, now that she's seen you, it would be best if you came out and said hello," said the prince kindly to the mannequin. The mannequin scurried over sheepishly, darting from one hiding place to the next, and then lastly behind Benjamin's legs, on the opposite side of the table from Abigail. Now you should understand that Fern was not normally as fearful as she came off. In fact, she may have been the bravest little girl whom Abigail had ever met, but sometimes even when brave people meet someone new for the very first time they can feel a bit shy. Also you must understand that Abigail did look uncannily like a dryad, and Fern appeared to be a child of 8 years old. To know how Fern felt, just imagine that you woke up one morning and the boogeyman had decided to join your family for breakfast. Now even if the boogeyman was behaving very civil, and carrying on quite well with your older brother, you would be a right fool if you did not keep a good distance between the two of you, just in case he suddenly decided to snatch you up. Fern's greeting was a quick curtsy and she tried to say how do you do, but nothing came out. Now that Abigail was able to get a good look at Fern, she was simply amazed. Not a mannequin at all, but a metal child made of tin and gears. Her head was featureless apart from her 2 eyes that looked like a pair of camera lenses. She had a big silk bow on her antenna and another on her back. She also had a very pretty dress with plenty of ruffles and lace. With one hand she clung to her brother's leg, with the other she held a stuffed doll with the face of a sunflower. Abigail couldn't help but think that she was absolutely adorable. "Oh my goodness! Look at you, you are the most darling little creature I think I've ever laid eyes on," doted Abigail, trying to coax her out. "I could just eat you up." I'm afraid Fern took that statement much more literally than Abigail had intended it, and retreated even further behind her brother. "Abigail, I would like you to meet my dear little sister, Fern, my only family in this world," said the prince, then added, "Please forgive her, I think she still believes you're a dryad." "Those were the things I was tied to," said Abigail, Why do they look like me, I mean like humans? A dryad is a very dangerous beast that lives deep in the magical woods. They came to Realm when the paths between the worlds were still open. What world they originally came from no one can rightly say, but they soon showed up on every world visited by man. Since image bearers are so revered by the other races, they are able to trick many innocent people. Some even believe that they were once men themselves turned wild, but now that I see you, I can tell they are only a poor counterfeit. They are naught but cruel beasts that hunt gentlefolk, mimicking intelligent creatures to lead them to their doom, explained the prince. Why do they all look like the same girl? Asked Abigail. The ones in that wood do, but in other forests they look different. Where I grew up they had hair as black as coal, and eyes like blue sapphires, said the prince with a shudder. But are there no young or old dryads? Are they immortal, like spirits or something? Asked Abigail. They do grow old, but they will always look the same age. Think hard, back to when you were with them. Did not some seem a bit more worn out than the others? Those were the older dryads, said the prince. All will look the same, young and old, male and female, for their outward appearance is just a disguise to help them catch people unaware, and without a good one they would surely starve. Wait, male? There were only women, said Abigail. Are you quite sure? Asked the prince, for the one who bit my arm seemed very much like a male to me. The prince could tell by the look on Abigail's face she was still confused, so he added, think to when you have watchbirds in the wild. Who is it that has the brightest feathers, the sweetest song, the tallest stature? Is it not always the males? True, said Abigail. But that's just so they can impress the females. So why would it not be the same among the dryads? Asked the prince leadingly. Fern, seeing that Benjamin was going to let Abigail continue to stay in their house, then did something that was inexcusable. And looking back at it she was very much ashamed of her actions, especially since she and Abigail were soon to become fast friends. She tugged on her brother's jacket so he would lean over and pass a message. After the prince heard it he responded by saying, I most certainly will not, and if you want to say something so rude you can very well say it yourself, but I wouldn't recommend it. Abigail, trying to be helpful, leaned forward and said, it's okay. Don't worry sweetie, you can tell me. I'll even lean close so you won't have to say it very loud if you don't want to. Fern clenched her fists and mustered up just enough courage to whisper, go away, I hate you. Then ran out of the room. Don't mind her, said the prince a little embarrassed, she'll soon warm up to you. The rest of the day was full of amazing spectacles and many questions from both Abigail and the prince. Abigail spent a lot longer than she thought trying to explain to Benjamin what a pineapple was. Benjamin in turn shared with her the reason for his oddly shaped cottage. Apparently, he had bought it from a dwarf when he came to South Innsbruck. He did not make it very clear as to why he first came to the land of Beren from Greenland, but it did have to do with some sort of war up north. It was obvious, however, that the prince had little interest of speaking about it. After the war he could not afford the trip back, so he set up a life as a tinkerer in Chatterdale, and built out his home to accommodate whichever new interest he was pursuing at the time. Abigail felt if there was anyone that could help her figure out how to get home it would be the prince. And for Benjamin's part he was quick to promise that he would do all he could to help the girl. In fact, he seemed to have remembered reading something recently about image bearers, and spent a good portion of the next few days rooting through his libraries in an attempt to find it. Soon the sky grew dark and night was upon them, so Abigail headed to her bedroom. Although she was now safe, Abigail always remembered that night as one of the most difficult nights she ever had in Realm. For the reality of being in a new world was finally setting in on her. Now one thing you must remember about a magical adventure, is that it is much more enjoyable if you know that you will be safe, and are confident that you will eventually make your way home. Presently Abigail was not sure of either, so she wasn't enjoying herself in the least. But there was one familiar thing that gave her comfort. That wherever this place was, it was not so far away that God wasn't still with her. "Now God," she began, "I seem to have landed in a bit of trouble that I can't rightly get out of myself, so if it's not too much of a burden, I happen to be in perilous need of a way home. And I would be ever so grateful if you found it in your heart to provide me one. But, regardless, it's good to know that you're still with me, even in this strange place." And she realized that it wasn't adventure at all that she wanted, just the courage to live her plain old ordinary life true to herself instead of doing what others expected of her. For now she would give anything to be back home with her family, safe and sound. She had always saw adventure as her escape, but didn't think much of it past the idea. So now, finding herself in the midst of a strange world, there was a great deal of the experience that she did not like. But it is your behavior in a situation that you would much rather not be in that truly shows your mettle. And luckily for Abigail, she was made of something much tougher than even she could imagine. For a solid week Fern spent her time scurrying around the house keeping a close watch on Abigail. She had also had a few sleepless nights watching her door surrounded by her bravest stuffed animals, in case Abigail tried to steal her away in the middle of the night. But Fern's heart softened towards Abigail, when she discovered the girl was not a dryad, but rather someone who felt very much alone. One morning after breakfast, as the sun had just begun to warm the house, Fern found Abigail reading one of the prince's books in the solarium, sitting in the sun in a large felt chair with some tea next to her. "That's not yours, you know," said Fern, clinging the edge of the door in barely more than a whisper. Since Abigail was not facing the door, she didn't hear what Fern had said. Fern ventured a little further, this time close enough to at least be seen by Abigail, and repeated herself. Abigail looked up from her book briefly when she heard Fern, but went back to reading, barely acknowledging her. She had decided that Fern was like her neighbor's shy cat, who ran away whenever you moved towards it but was often too curious to stay away for long. "You shouldn't read other people's things, it's rude," said Fern, trying to get a rise out of Abigail. But she just kept reading. "Get out of our house, monster, we don't want you here," said Fern, getting a little closer. "Put it back," Fern insisted, getting closer still, but Abigail continued to ignore her. Then Fern came up and snatched the book out of Abigail's hands and set it aside. "Stop it," insisted Fern. Abigail calmly picked up another book from beside the chair. Fern snatched that away too. "You can't read that one either," she said angrily. Abigail moved towards a third book, but Fern went and lay across the whole pile. "You can't have any," she said. Abigail then reached for her tea, but Fern jumped up to stop her there too. "No, that's not for you, monsters don't get tea," said Fern authoritatively. When Fern reached for the tea, she put both hands on Abigail's. This made Abigail smile because she knew Fern wasn't afraid of her anymore, but she was careful to hide it from Fern, for if Fern discovered she wasn't being taken seriously, it could truly hurt her feelings. "What should I do then?" asked Abigail. "Go sit in that corner," commanded Fern. Abigail acquiesced, moving over to the far side of the room. Fern took her spot in the chair and began pretending to drink Abigail's tea. I say pretend because Fern's head really didn't have a mouth to speak of. This tea is delicious and for trees only, and definitely not for monsters," said Fern. After this also failed to get a reaction out of Abigail, Fern just sat back in her chair and stared at Abigail. She wasn't sure, but Abigail thought Fern might be pouting. After a long while of staring, Fern asked, "Do monsters have families?" "I wouldn't know, I'm not a monster," said Abigail. "Well, whatever you are, do you have a family?" asked Fern. "I have a family, a mom and a dad, a sister and a brother," said Abigail. "He acted a lot like you when he was younger, in fact he still does, sometimes. I miss them terribly, and hope to see them again soon. I used to have a big family. I don't anymore," said Fern sadly, then looked out the window far away from Abigail and added, "I miss them too. My brother says we'll all be together someday, in beautiful fields that surround a giant city of gold, and inside that city lives the Imagine Bear. He's supposed to be kind and just, and look just like God. And everyone we love and miss will be there, waiting for us," said Fern, still looking a long way off, but in her voice there was a trace of hope. Then she added, "But after all that we've been through, sometimes I get worried that he just made up those stories for my sake, so I could have something to look forward to, because since we came to Baron there hasn't been a whole lot of things to hope in." "You know," said Abigail, "just because something gives you hope doesn't always mean it's made up. Sometimes true things can give us hope in a way something made up never could. You know, for a monster you aren't all bad, I suppose, but it still doesn't mean I trust you," said Fern. "My brother may trust you, but he's always looking for the best in people. He says we should do our best to love others around us, and if they hurt us or judge us, that's something between them and God, for there's a lot of pain in this world and it is much to do with too many people withholding love from one another." "Your brother seems pretty smart," said Abigail. "You can think that way if you like," said Fern, who was tugging on something on the front of her dress, "but I don't like it when he does. It's too dangerous. He's all I have left, and in this world if you don't look out for yourself no one else will either. Sometimes I'm afraid that I might lose him like everyone else." "Do monsters ever get afraid?" "I wouldn't know," began Abigail, but Fern cut her off. "Right, you're not a monster. Well then, do you get scared?" asked Fern. "I suppose so, but to be fair, there seems to be a lot more things to be afraid of here than where I came from," said Abigail. "If you're still scared you can come sit by me, just this once, if you want," said Fern. Abigail got up from her corner and sat in the chair next to Fern, who pulled Abigail's arms around her shoulders and began to fidget with Abigail's hands. Abigail noticed that Fern's hands, though made of metal, still felt warm and alive. As the child sat upon Abigail's lap she radiated a soft, steady heat, from the small engines that ran constantly inside of her. Despite all her brave words earlier, Abigail could tell that Fern was just as scared and lonely as she was, in her own way. Fern, finally feeling safe, grew very sleepy, but right before she dozed off she said, "I know you're a monster, but maybe you could protect me from all the other monsters out there, you know, the bad ones." "I'm not began Abigail, but her heart would not let her say anything besides, "Of course, always,